This week, the mayor of America's largest city stood in front of the flags of the United States and New York, looked into a camera, and called a sitting head of state a war criminal who should be arrested. That alone would be a story. But what happened next, the reaction from Washington, from Jerusalem, and from his own party, is what actually matters here. Let's break it down, and look at where this goes from here. This isn't just a New York City story, and it isn't just about one mayor's video. It sits at the intersection of international law, a deeply divided Democratic Party, and a shift in American public opinion on Israel that most of Washington still hasn't fully absorbed. Stay with us, the forecast at the end is where this gets interesting. Start with what was actually said. On Tuesday night, New York Mayor Zohran Mamdani released a video statement addressing Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu directly. He called Netanyahu, in his words, the architect of a horrific genocide against the Palestinian people, and said New York's law department had examined every legal option for arresting him during his expected visit in September for the UN General Assembly. The conclusion Mamdani reached was that the city does not have independent legal authority to execute the warrant itself. So instead, he turned the demand outward, calling on the federal government to do what New York City cannot. This wasn't a spontaneous outburst. Mamdani had promised almost exactly this during his mayoral campaign, telling interviewers as far back as December of 2024 that if elected, New York would arrest Netanyahu under the warrant issued by the International Criminal Court. That warrant, issued in November 2024, accuses Netanyahu and his former defense minister, Yoav Gallant, of war crimes and crimes against humanity, specifically, intentionally depriving the population of Gaza of food, water, fuel, and medicine. Both men have denied the accusations. Now let's talk about why this warrant, specifically, keeps resurfacing as a political flashpoint. The United States is not a member of the International Criminal Court. Washington has never recognized its jurisdiction over American allies, and that fact alone makes the warrant largely symbolic on U.S. soil. Legal scholars have also pointed to another obstacle. Sitting heads of government generally carry a form of legal immunity that shields them from arrest by foreign domestic authorities, regardless of what an international court has ruled. In other words, even if Mamdani wanted to act, multiple layers of law stood between him and actually doing it. And the mayor, to his credit, acknowledged that reality this week rather than repeating a campaign promise he couldn't keep. It's worth remembering this warrant has already been a flashpoint once before. When it was first issued back in 2024, the reaction in Washington was swift and largely hostile, across both parties. The Biden administration rejected the court's decision outright at the time. Several members of Congress introduced resolutions condemning the ICC itself, arguing the court had no legitimate authority over Israeli officials acting in self-defense. That backdrop matters, because it shows Mamdani isn't just picking a fight with Netanyahu. He's picking a fight with a bipartisan Washington consensus that has held for nearly 2 years. The response came fast, and from several directions at once. President Trump addressed it directly, saying Netanyahu would not be arrested on American soil under any circumstance. Israel's ambassador to the United Nations, Danny Danon, went further, accusing Mamdani of spreading propaganda and telling him to focus on his actual job. Netanyahu's office, in a separate statement, suggested the mayor was using the controversy to distract from problems at home. But the sharper story may be the reaction inside Mamdani's own coalition. This is not a fringe position anymore, and it's not universally popular even among progressives. Democratic Representative Jerry Nadler, whose district includes part of New York City, has previously called the arrest idea simply unrealistic, noting flatly that the city has no jurisdiction to attempt it. Some immigrant advocacy leaders within Mamdani's own base have said publicly that this fight isn't their priority. At the same time, Mamdani is not operating in a vacuum of public opinion. According to Pew Research Center polling cited around this controversy, a majority of Americans now hold a negative view of Israel, including a majority of adults under 50 in both parties, and roughly 80% of Democrats and Democratic-leaning independents. Whatever you think of the mayor's approach, the underlying sentiment he's tapping into is a real and growing shift in American public opinion, not an isolated position. It's also worth noting Mamdani didn't stop at Netanyahu. Asked directly whether the same standard should apply to Hamas's former military chief, who also had an ICC warrant issued against him, Mamdani said his position was not specific to any one leader, that he considers the October 7th attack itself a war crime, and that his position applies to anyone the court has charged, regardless of nationality. Whether that framing satisfies his critics is very much part of the ongoing argument. Here's the deeper tension underneath all of this. Israel's own government maintains it has taken, in its words, unprecedented wartime measures to minimize civilian harm while fighting Hamas. Independent United Nations commissions, along with rights groups including Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, have separately described Israel's conduct in Gaza using the word genocide. Israel rejects that characterization entirely. That gap, between how Israel describes its own conduct and how international monitors have characterized it, is the fault line running underneath this entire story, and it isn't close to resolving. Now, let's get into the forecast. Where does this actually go? First, expect no arrest. This is close to certain. Between the lack of U.S. recognition of the ICC, presidential immunity norms, and the president's explicit public statement, there is no realistic legal path to Netanyahu being detained in New York in September. If he attends the UN General Assembly as expected, expect him to do so freely, likely under heavy security, with this controversy as a backdrop rather than an obstacle. Second, expect this to become a defining flashpoint in Mamdani's relationship with Washington. This is very likely to resurface every time his administration and the federal government interact on unrelated issues: funding, immigration enforcement, security for the UN session itself. Expect Republicans in Congress to invoke this repeatedly as a talking point against him, and don't be surprised if there are symbolic congressional resolutions condemning his comments, similar to ones introduced after the original ICC warrants in 2024. Third, expect this to widen, not narrow, the divide inside the Democratic Party. You have a growing generational and ideological split between Democrats who view unconditional support for Israel as politically untouchable, and a newer, younger wing, energized by Mamdani's win, that sees this exact kind of confrontation as core to their politics. Watch how other Democratic mayors, governors, and 2028 hopefuls respond in the coming weeks. Their answers, or their silence, will tell you a lot about where the party is actually heading. Fourth, watch the September UN General Assembly itself as the next real flashpoint. That's when Netanyahu is expected in New York, and that's when this story stops being about a video statement and becomes about actual security planning, protest activity, and almost certainly, another Mamdani statement timed to the visit. And fifth, keep an eye on the polling trend, not just this one controversy. If the shift Pew is tracking continues, younger Americans and Democrats moving further from unconditional support for Israeli government policy, this kind of confrontation stops being an outlier and starts becoming a preview of where mainstream Democratic politics is headed over the next several election cycles. Here's the bottom line. Mamdani cannot arrest Netanyahu, and he said so himself this week. But that was never really the point of the video. It was a statement aimed at Washington, at his own party, and at a domestic audience whose views on this conflict have shifted further than most of Washington has caught up to. Whether that's read as principled or as political theater depends entirely on who you ask, and that divide is exactly the story to watch going into September. We'll be tracking the UN General Assembly visit and the Democratic Party's response in the weeks ahead. If you want stories like this explained before they become headlines, subscribe to Global Brief. We'll see you in the next one.